Now, after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night and went to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the Magi. Then what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled: "He will be called a Nazarene." May God add his blessing to the reading, hearing, and understanding of these words. So today's message title is Call, Politics, and Provision. It's going to be divided into those three distinct parts. So you'll know when I get towards the end of the third one that you can start having a sigh of relief because it's almost done. All right. God's call. The book of Matthew is full of dreams. When Joseph learns that Mary is having a child, he is visited by an angel in a dream who tells Joseph to go ahead and get married, not instead of trying to save Mary the embarrassment by divorcing her, which I don't quite understand, but I'm sure I could look it up and find out why that was. The angel in Joseph's dream said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Dude, this is a special baby, and you're the one who's going to protect it." After the baby Jesus is born, some foreigner astrologers stopped to talk to the ruler, Herod, on their way to investigate a star rising in the night sky. They were expecting to find a significant person at the end of their journey. Herod, covering his bases, asked the Magi to find this person and report back to him, because Herod's heard how much his Jewish subjects were looking forward to a new ruler. They were not real fond of him. In another dream, the Magi were warned to not report back to Herod. They heed the warning and they take I-270 around Herod's castle. In today's text, we hear the third and fourth dream, and maybe the fifth as I think about it towards the end. And Joseph's getting the message to take the family to flee to Egypt, and the message that Herod is dead and it's safe to return to their native land. Why would Matthew tell the Christmas story this way? In Luke, we have cattle lowing and shepherds quaking, while angels are direct messengers to Mary and Zechariah and the shepherds and make pronouncements of good tidings of great joy of the day of Jesus' birth. That version of the story is soft and fuzzy and warm, which is the way I like to feel about Christmas. I don't know. How about you? But Matthew wrote his account because of his audience. Luke was a historian trying to provide a comprehensive telling of the facts of Jesus' birth, life, teachings, death, and resurrection, based upon recollections of people who could possibly have been there at the time. A history book is written to anyone who was looking for the information about the past. But Matthew is talking directly to a very distraught audience of Jews. Matthew was a Jew himself, speaking to other Jews. Sometime after the destruction of the temple in 70, the Common Era in Rome, by Rome. This was the second temple the Jewish people had built, and it stood in Jerusalem for 420 years before it was destroyed. Now, I know there is some angst about the current construction at the White House, and it was built in 1902 and expanded in 1942. So 420 some years, they were upset about the destruction, and they thought it signaled the end of the world. So Matthew, who was also a follower of the teaching of Jesus, wanted to help these very distraught Jewish people understand that this wasn't the end of times, it was the beginning. He was doing this by pitching Jesus as the fulfillment of the Hebrew scriptures. So that's why we get all of these things that are referring back to the Old Testament. In Matthew 2, verse 6, we hear the great leader will come from Bethlehem, which is a paraphrase combining messages from Micah 5:2 and 2 Samuel 5:2. Isn't that odd? And is an allusion to King David. The phrase, out of Egypt I have called my son, is Matthew's way of linking Jesus to the leadership of Moses. A voice was heard in Ramah was from the prophet Jeremiah. The people of the post-temple destruction time were afraid and unmoored. Matthew's goal was to provide them hope by pointing to scriptures they were familiar with, and then linking those texts with the one who was sent to the world to show them and us the way to live. Angelic dreams in Matthew is analogous to angelic visitors in Luke. In both cases, it was God who was doing the calling. We're moving on to God's politics. Matthew reminds his listeners about the unhinged ruler Herod, who had lived anywhere between 5 and 9 decades before the time of writing Matthew's gospel. Herod was not a Jew, but an Idumean appointed by Rome, and that is why he was always insecure about being a ruler of the Jewish people, who were not his fans, as I said before. He was particularly concerned about losing his throne because he had been told by temple leaders that, according to Jewish scriptures, a new leader would come forth from the Jewish people. After the arrival of the Magi, Herod asks his advisors where the new ruler is to be born, and they tell him Bethlehem. When the Magi ghost him and do not report back to the exact position of the ruler, that leads to unimaginable horror visited upon the Jewish population of Bethlehem, when Herod's soldiers are ordered to kill all of the infants and toddlers in the village and the surrounding area. I wonder if any of those soldiers disobeyed any of that order. Because Joseph had listened to the angel in the dream, Jesus, Joseph, and Mary are safely on the way to Egypt. We are so familiar with this story that we just move on because it's uncomfortable to reconcile the killing of the many lives for the sake of the one. The question is as old as time. Why do bad things happen to good or innocent people? The gospel tells us that Jesus came into a broken world to save it. But we are also told that when humanity came to be, God gave us the ability to choose how we want to live. Sometimes we mess up accidentally. Sometimes, as was the case in the killing of the innocents, we purposely defy God in both small and large ways. There have always been those who are not able to reconcile suffering with the loving Creator. Some of us mark it all up to God's plan. And it is possible that God has a minute-by-minute plan for us. I'm not denying that. But that, in my mind, makes us puppets and God the puppet master. There is no free will in that idea. And it lets us off the hook for choosing to act in such a way that ignores what Jesus told us was a summation of the law and the prophets. Love God and love your neighbor. I think we are free to do as we please. Even those who choose cruelty to preserve their own power can make choices about their actions. Also, we can write off our discomfort with the paradox of the many dying for the one, with the opposite, the one dying for the many. When Jesus was killed by the Romans, with the collusion of Jewish leaders, one explanation is that it was God's will for that to happen so that we could be saved from our sins because God demanded punishment for sin. If that's your belief, you're in the mainstream. However, there are at least 10 theories of atonement, and my favorite is one posited by John MacLeod Campbell, a Scottish theologian and contemporary of Alexander and Thomas Campbell, but no relationship to them. According to John Campbell, atonement results from Christ's identification with us. Christ lived a life of self-sacrifice, identified with us by suffering on the cross, and repented on our behalf, thereby leading God to be merciful to all sinners. In any case, understanding God's politics, God's method of dealing with humanity, is not simple or easy. I'm not sure any of us are able to truly understand, and that is why we decide to have faith in the God that Jesus describes to us. Jesus understood. Each of us comes to our beliefs from different perspectives, and no one is an expert. But to consider ourselves as followers of Jesus, our faith must be grounded in the bedrock of his teachings. Love God and love our neighbors as ourselves. All right, we're to section 3, God's provision. As we return to the story of Jesus' early days, as told by Matthew, we see that God provided a way for Jesus, Mary, and Joseph to avoid the action of Herod. They moved to Egypt, and they were sheltered in that foreign land 2 years after the birth of Jesus. For 2 years. And 2 years after the birth of Jesus, Herod died. When the family returned, they did not go back to Bethlehem, which in Matthew's gospel is where they lived prior to fleeing. Instead, they moved to Nazareth. The distance between these 2 points is, as the crow flies, about 70 miles, but the way the roads go, kind of like they do around here, it was 90 miles. Jesus grew up in a place where no one was looking for him. He was sheltered and trained in the scriptures and as a carpenter. We assume he lived a very normal life up until he was about 30 years old, as there's very little information about the intervening years. God provided loving parents, brothers and sisters, and a life lived just like the contemporaries of his day. God provided guidance to Jesus the same way God does for us, through prayer and meditation. So what about us? What about God's call on our lives? When God calls on us, how do we respond? Now, I'd like to think I'm old enough that I don't have to have any more calls, but I know that there's been a call on my life, and there's been multiple calls on all of your lives through the years. And unfortunately, my faith tells me that there's no quitting time. I have to continue to love God and neighbor and do whatever I can, whenever I can, in whatever way I can. Now, sometimes it's very inconvenient, and sometimes I do answer, not this time, sorry. But I believe that God will continue to call me and you to action until the day we leave this realm for whatever lies ahead. How about us and God's politics? As long as there are at least 2 people on the earth, there will be politics. For me, God's politics boil down to this: God is God, and I am not, and you are not either. God is the creator of life and the author of love. He sent Jesus to tell us how to live with one another, and the best political move we can make is to remember that and live accordingly. Finally, God's provision. God has provided us with life, a planet to live upon, and companions for the journey. What we do with the provision is up to us. But I would suggest that we treat our world and our neighbors with the same love we want God to treat us with. God has provided us with the ability to pray and meditate in order to seek answers to thorny questions. When we get an answer, we process that answer with the teachings of Jesus before we dive in. When we don't get an answer, we do the same thing. We may not have angels visiting us in dreams, but if we pay attention, God will lead us in the right direction. Amen.